God doesn't exist, a millionaire arrogantly declares, humiliating a little beggar girl in the middle of the street. In the following days, the millionaire becomes desperate as sudden failures turn his life upside down. Alexander Sterling stood at the top of his empire, a gleaming 70-story skyscraper that pierced the Manhattan skyline like a silver needle. The board meeting had just concluded, and his latest acquisition, a chain of struggling hospitals he planned to transform into luxury medical centers, had been unanimously approved. The satisfaction of victory coursed through his veins as he adjusted his custom-made Italian suit and checked his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. At 45, Alexander had everything he'd ever wanted. His net worth had just crossed the billion-dollar mark, and his reputation as a ruthless business magnate preceded him in every room he entered. He prided himself on never letting emotions cloud his judgment, never letting sentimentality interfere with profit. His motto, "Survival of the Fittest," hung in gold letters behind his desk, a testament to his Darwinian view of the world. The EUC elevator ride down to the lobby was spent reviewing the day's stock performances on his phone, another record high. He allowed himself a small smile, not the warm kind that reached the eyes, but the cold, calculated type that acknowledged a plan well executed. The world was his chessboard and he was the grandmaster. As he stepped out of his building, the autumn wind carried the scent of success, or perhaps it was just his $1,000 cologne mixing with the crisp October air. His driver had called in sick. Incompetent help was so hard to avoid these days, so he decided to walk the few blocks to his favorite restaurant, Le Cirque. He had a standing reservation, of course. The sidewalks of New York City were crowded with the usual rush-hour masses, what he privately referred to as the herd. He navigated through them with practiced indifference, barely registering their existence. That was until a small voice pierced through his carefully constructed bubble of superiority. "Please, sir. God bless you." Alexander stopped, more out of surprise than compassion. The voice belonged to a girl who couldn't have been more than 12, sitting cross-legged on the cold pavement. Her clothes were worn but clean, and despite her circumstances, her eyes held an unsettling brightness. She held a small empty cup in her dirty hands. Something about her gaze made him uncomfortable. It wasn't the usual desperate plea he was used to ignoring from street beggars. Instead, her eyes held what appeared to be hope. The absurdity of it made him laugh. "God bless me," he repeated, his voice dripping with derision. "Little girl, let me teach you something valuable. God, if he exists, clearly doesn't care about you. Look at where you are and look at where I am. I built my empire through intelligence and determination, not through prayers and blessings." The girl's expression didn't change. If anything, her smile grew warmer. "That's okay, sir. I'll still pray for you." Her response irritated him more than it should have. He was used to people cowering before him, not maintaining their composure, certainly not offering to pray for him. "Save your prayers," he sneered. "They're worth about as much as that empty cup of yours." As he turned to walk away, the girl's voice followed him, soft but clear. "Sometimes the emptiest cups are the ones that need filling the most." Alexander felt a strange shiver run down his spine, but he dismissed it as a reaction to the cooling evening air. He continued his walk to Le Cirque, pushing the encounter out of his mind. He had more important things to think about, like the champagne he would order to celebrate his latest triumph. Yet as he waited for the maitre d' to escort him to his usual table, the girl's words echoed in his mind. He ordered a double scotch instead of champagne, telling himself it was just to warm up from the walk. But deep down, something felt different. Something had shifted ever so slightly in his perfectly ordered world. Little did Alexander know, but that encounter would mark the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he believed about success, power, and the very foundation of his existence. The universe had plans for Alexander Sterling, and they were about to unfold in ways he could never have imagined. The first sign that something was amiss came during Alexander's perfectly cooked Wagyu steak. His phone buzzed with an urgent message from his head of legal affairs, Charlotte Weber. The text was uncharacteristically brief. "Turn on CNN now." Alexander signaled the waiter, who quickly brought over a tablet kept specifically for VIP guests. As the screen came to life, he nearly choked on his $900 bottle of Bordeaux. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, "Breaking. Sterling Medical Acquisition faces federal investigation." His fingers trembled slightly as he called Charlotte. She answered on the first ring. "Alex, it's bad. Someone leaked documents suggesting we knew about the hospital's financial mismanagement before the acquisition. They're alleging we planned to let them fail so we could buy them at a fraction of their worth." "That's ridiculous," Alexander hissed, keeping his voice low despite the private dining room. "We followed every regulation to the letter. I personally reviewed all the paperwork." "There's more," Charlotte continued, her voice tense. "The source claims to have evidence that we deliberately prevented potential buyers from making competing offers, if that's true." "It's not true," he interrupted. "Find out who's behind this. I want them buried in lawsuits by morning." He ended the call before she could respond. The exquisite meal now tasted like ash in his mouth. Alexander Sterling didn't believe in coincidences, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something larger than a simple business setback was unfolding. He reached for his wineglass, only to find it inexplicably cracked, a thin line running from base to rim. Outside the restaurant, the evening had turned unseasonably cold. Alexander pulled his cashmere coat tighter and decided to walk home, hoping the exercise would help clear his head. As he passed the spot where he'd encountered the little girl earlier, he found himself pausing. She was gone, of course, but something about the empty sidewalk made him uneasy. His phone buzzed again. This time it was his financial advisor, Michael Chang. "Mr. Sterling, we're seeing some unusual activity in the Asian markets. Your positions—" The call dropped suddenly. Alexander pulled the phone from his ear and stared at the screen in disbelief. No service. In the middle of Manhattan. He looked up to see that the streetlights around him had dimmed, creating pools of shadow where there should have been light. A newspaper carried by the wind wrapped around his ankle. As he bent to pull it away, the headlines caught his eye. "Market experts predict major downtown correction." The date on the paper was tomorrow's. Alexander blinked hard, but when he looked again, the paper showed today's date and a different headline. He crumpled it and threw it aside, quickening his pace. The sound of his Italian leather shoes on the pavement seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet street. When he finally reached his penthouse apartment, Alexander went straight to his private bar and poured himself a generous measure of 50-year-old scotch. The familiar burn of the alcohol helped steady his nerves, but as he walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows to survey his domain, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the condensation on the glass, words had formed as if written by an invisible finger. "Empty cups need filling." Alexander backed away from the window, his heart pounding. He grabbed a towel from the bar and wiped the glass furiously, erasing the message. "I'm working too hard," he muttered to himself. "That's all this is." His phone rang again, Charlotte with updates about the investigation. As he listened to her outline the growing crisis, his eyes were drawn back to the window. The condensation was gone, but for a moment he could have sworn he saw the reflection of a small figure standing behind him, holding an empty cup. When he spun around, the room was empty. But Alexander Sterling, the man who had built an empire on cold logic and ruthless certainty, felt the first real tremor of doubt in his perfectly constructed world. As he turned back to the window, the lights in neighboring buildings began to wink out one by one, leaving him alone in the gathering darkness. Alexander awoke to the sound of rain pattering against his bedroom windows. The digital display on his nightstand showed 3:33 a.m., casting an eerie red glow across the room. His silk pajamas were damp with sweat, and the remnants of a dream he couldn't quite remember lingered at the edges of his consciousness. He reached for his phone, dreading what new disasters might have unfolded while he slept. The screen remained black, dead. He pressed the power button repeatedly, but nothing happened. Cursing under his breath, he swung his legs out of bed and walked to his home office. The moment he entered the room, his computer screen flickered to life without being touched. Numbers began scrolling across it: stock prices, account balances, investment portfolios. Everything was dropping, falling, disappearing. Alexander rushed to the desk, his fingers flying across the keyboard, trying to access his accounts, but each attempt was met with an error message: access denied. A soft chime from his elevator made him freeze. Nobody should be able to access his penthouse at this hour. His security system was state-of-the-art. He moved cautiously toward the hallway, telling himself it was probably just a mechanical glitch. The elevator doors slid open with a whisper, revealing an empty car. But as Alexander watched, paralyzed, water began seeping out from under the doors, spreading across his imported marble floors. Not clear water, but murky street puddle water, bringing with it the smell of wet concrete and desperation. "This isn't real," he muttered, backing away. "This can't be real." A child's laughter echoed through his apartment, coming from everywhere, and nowhere at once. Alexander spun around, searching for its source, but he was alone. The sound faded, replaced by a soft whisper that seemed to ride on the pre-dawn air. "Sometimes we must lose everything to find what truly matters." When he turned back to the elevator, the water was gone. The floors were perfectly dry, as if nothing had happened, but Alexander's hands were shaking as he poured himself a drink from his private bar. The sun was rising over the city by the time his phone finally came back to life, immediately flooding with messages. His lawyers needed an emergency meeting. The SEC was launching a formal investigation into his recent acquisitions. 3 major investors were threatening to pull out of his next project. Alexander barely registered the mounting disasters. His mind kept returning to the strange events of the night, trying to rationalize them away. Stress-induced hallucinations, he told himself. Nothing more than exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. He tried to follow his normal morning routine: premium coffee brewed by his imported Italian machine, a workout in his private gym, a shower in his marble bathroom. But everything felt slightly off-kilter, as if the world had shifted a few degrees while he wasn't looking. The mirror in his bathroom fogged up despite the ventilation system that should have prevented it. As he wiped it clear with his hand, words began forming in the remaining condensation. "Look closer." Alexander stumbled backward, almost slipping, on the wet floor. The message remained, defying his attempts to explain it away. As he stared at it, other words began appearing around it, filling the mirror with an impossible message. "Your empire is built on empty promises. Your wealth cannot shield you from what's coming. The time for change is now, or everything will be taken away." His phone rang, making him jump. It was Charlotte again, her voice tight with concern. "Alex, you need to get to the office right away. The board is calling an emergency meeting. They're talking about a vote of no confidence." Alexander hardly heard her. His eyes were fixed on the mirror where a new message was forming. "She prays for you still." The image of the little girl flashed in his mind. Her bright eyes, her gentle smile, her empty cup. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Sterling felt truly afraid. Not of losing his money or his power, but of something he couldn't name. Something that seemed to be reaching for him from beyond the edges of his rational world. He dressed mechanically, choosing one of his $1,000 suits without really seeing it. As he prepared to face what promised to be the most challenging day of his career, he couldn't shake the feeling that these business troubles were just the beginning. Something fundamental was shifting in his world, and for once, all his money and power couldn't stop it. The Sterling Industries building had never felt so hostile. As Alexander walked through the lobby, he noticed employees averting their eyes, conversations stopping abruptly as he passed. The morning headlines were everywhere, on phones, tablets, the lobby's news screens. His carefully crafted reputation was unraveling in real time. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, his executive assistant, Maria, was waiting with a stack of messages and a worried expression. "Mr. Sterling, the board members are already in the conference room, and there's something else." Before she could continue, Alexander's attention was caught by movement in his office. Through the glass walls, he could see someone sitting in his chair facing the window. His anger flared. No one dared to enter his office without permission. He stormed toward the door, ready to unleash his fury on the intruder. But when he threw open the door, the chair was empty. What stopped him in his tracks, however, was what had been done to his prized motto on the wall. The golden letters that had spelled out survival of the fittest had been rearranged. They now read, "Fit your soul to survive." The rest of the letters were scattered on his desk, spelling out smaller messages. "Listen. Change. Time runs short." "Maria," he called out, his voice shaking despite his effort to control it. "Who has been in my office?" His assistant hurried in, confusion clear on her face. "No one, Mr. Sterling. The security system shows no entry since you left last night. Is something wrong?" Alexander stared at the wall, but the letters were back in their original position, his motto intact. He pressed his fingers to his temples, trying to focus. "Never mind. Tell me about the board meeting." Maria's expression grew even more concerned. "They've been reviewing the hospital acquisition documents. There are irregularities they want to discuss. And Mr. Peterson from legal says there's a problem with the foundation's accounts." The Sterling Foundation was supposed to be his masterpiece of public relations, a charitable organization that made strategic donations to enhance his corporate image. He had never cared about its actual work, seeing it only as a tax write-off and a way to silence critics. The conference room fell silent as Alexander entered. 12 pairs of eyes watched him take his seat at the head of the table. Thomas Bradford, the head of the board, spoke first. "Alex, we've discovered some disturbing information about the Foundation's activities." As Bradford began detailing the suspicious transactions and misallocated funds, Alexander's attention was drawn to the window behind him. In the reflection, he could see a small figure standing in the corner of the room, the little girl from the street, still holding her empty cup. He whirled around, but the corner was empty. When he turned back to the board, Bradford was staring at him strangely. "Are you feeling all right, Alex? You look pale." "Continue," Alexander managed to say, loosening his tie slightly. The room felt too warm, too close. But as Bradford resumed his presentation, the words on the screen behind him began to change. Between the graphs and spreadsheets, new text appeared. "Your foundation is hollow, just like your heart." The numbers on the financial statements morphed before his eyes, transforming into questions. How many lives could you have helped? What good is wealth without compassion? When did you lose your humanity? Alexander gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. The other board members seemed oblivious to the changing display. They continued discussing legal strategies and damage control, their voices becoming a distant buzz in his ears. A gentle touch on his shoulder made him jump. When he looked up for just a moment, he saw not Bradford but the little girl, her eyes full of that same unsettling hope. "It's not too late," she seemed to whisper, before the image dissolved and Bradford's concerned face came back into focus. "I think we should take a break," Bradford was saying. "Alex, perhaps you should get some rest. You don't seem yourself." Alexander Sterling, the man who had never shown weakness in front of his board, found himself unable to protest. As he stumbled out of the conference room, he heard whispers following him. The pressure must be getting to him. "Perhaps we should accelerate the vote. The company needs stable leadership." In his office, he collapsed into his chair, his empire crumbling around him. On his desk, he found a single sheet of paper he didn't remember seeing before. On it, in childish handwriting, was a simple message. "Every empire falls, but some things are built to last forever. Choose wisely." Alexander's private elevator refused to move when he tried to leave the office that evening. After 3 attempts, he was forced to take the regular elevator, something he hadn't done in years. As the doors opened on the ground floor, he found himself sharing the space with a cleaning woman who looked to be in her 60s. She was humming softly as she pushed her cart, a familiar tune that took him a moment to recognize, the same lullaby he'd heard his mother sing when he was a child, before she'd left him with his emotionally distant father. The coincidence made his skin prickle. "Beautiful evening, isn't it, Mr. Sterling?" the woman said, though he wasn't wearing a name tag and had never seen her before. Sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in unexpected packages. Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone in the lobby. But her cart remained, and on it was a single photograph that made his breath catch. It showed him as a child, sitting on his mother's lap as she sang to him. A photograph that should have been impossible, as all family photos had been destroyed in a house fire decades ago. When he reached for it, the image changed. Now it showed the little girl from the street, but she was wearing the same dress his mother had worn in the previous image. The picture changed again, this time showing an empty chair in what looked like his office, illuminated by divine light streaming through the windows. Alexander stumbled backward, bumping into the security desk. When he looked again, the cart was gone. The security guard was watching him with concern. "Are you all right, sir? You look like you've seen a ghost." The word ghost echoed in his mind as he hurried out of the building. The evening air was thick with fog that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. As he walked, the mist swirled around him in patterns that looked almost deliberate, forming shapes that disappeared when he tried to focus on them. His phone rang, the special ringtone he'd assigned to his private banker. "Mr. Sterling," the voice was tense, "there's been an irregularity with your accounts, all of them. The money, it's moving on its own." "What do you mean, moving?" Alexander demanded, stopping in the middle of the sidewalk. "Large donations are being made to various charities. We can't stop them. The authentication codes keep changing, but they're all valid. They're all coming from your personal authorization." Alexander's mind raced, millions of dollars being given away without his consent. He opened his banking app, but instead of his account information, he saw a message scrolling across the screen. "What good is wealth hoarded in empty vaults? Let it flow like water to those who thirst." A beggar approached him, hand outstretched. Alexander nearly pushed past him, but something made him stop. The man's eyes had the same otherworldly gleam he'd seen in the little girl's. "Spare some change?" the man asked, but his voice seemed to carry layers of meaning. Alexander reached for his wallet, surprising himself. Inside, where his collection of $100 bills should have been, he found only a single note. As he pulled it out, it transformed in his hands. One moment a $100 bill, the next a handwritten message. "The greatest wealth is in giving." His hands trembling, Alexander handed the bill to the beggar. The man's smile seemed to illuminate the foggy street. "God bless you," he said. And for the first time in Alexander's life, those words didn't fill him with contempt. As the man walked away, he seemed to fade into the mist. Alexander's phone buzzed again, another message about mysterious donations. But this time, instead of panic, he felt something else. A tiny crack had appeared in his wall of cynicism, letting in a glimmer of something he hadn't felt since childhood. He found himself walking without a clear destination, the fog parting before him like a living thing. Each step seemed to take him further from his familiar world of boardrooms and balance sheets, deeper into something he couldn't explain with his usual logical frameworks. Street musicians played on corners, their songs morphing into hymns as he passed. Store windows reflected not his expensive suit, but moments from his past, his mother's smile, his first act of kindness, the moments before ambition had hardened his heart. When he finally stopped walking, he found himself in front of a small church he'd never noticed before. The door stood open, warm light spilling out onto the steps. From inside came the sound of a choir practicing, their voices carrying the same lullaby the cleaning woman had been humming. For the first time in decades, Alexander Sterling felt tears forming in his eyes. He stood there, between his world, of material wealth, and something far more mysterious, as the fog continued to swirl around him with purpose and meaning. The church's interior was dimly lit by candles, their flames dancing in the draught from the open door. Alexander's footsteps echoed on the stone floor as he entered, each step seeming to carry the weight of his accumulated pride and arrogance. The choir he'd heard was nowhere to be seen, though their music still seemed to linger in the air. As he moved deeper into the church, the candles flickered in sequence, as if marking his path toward the altar. In the front pew, a figure sat, alone, an elderly priest reading from a worn Bible. Without looking up, he spoke. "I've been expecting you, Alexander." Alexander stopped, his heart pounding. "How do you know my name?" The priest closed his book and turned. His face was kind, but his eyes held the same penetrating quality he'd seen in the little girl and the beggar. "The same way I know that you've been running all your life, running from love, from faith, from the truth about what really matters." Before Alexander could respond, the church's stained glass windows began to glow. though it was well past sunset outside. Each panel seemed to come alive, showing scenes not from biblical stories, but from his own life. His mother singing him to sleep, his father's cold disapproval, his first business deal, the moment he'd decided that power was the only thing that mattered. "Your mother never abandoned you, you know," the priest said softly. "She was taken by illness, not by choice. Your father's grief turned to bitterness, and you learned the wrong lessons from his pain." Alexander sank into a pew, his legs no longer able to support him. "How can you know these things?" "The same way I know about the little girl who blessed you, even as you mocked her faith. The same way I know about every dollar you've earned and every soul you've stepped on to earn it." The priest's voice was gentle but firm. "The question is, Alexander, what will you do now that you can no longer hide from the truth?" The windows continued to shift, showing more recent scenes. The hospitals he'd planned to convert to luxury facilities, the families who would have been left without care, the employees whose lives he'd considered insignificant compared to his. Profits. But then the images changed, showing something else, possibilities. The same hospitals flourishing as centers of healing, children playing in new wings built for pediatric care, elderly patients being treated with dignity, his wealth transformed into a force for good. "It's not too late," the priest said, standing. "Grace doesn't follow the rules of compound interest. It multiplies in ways your financial models could never predict." A sound made Alexander turn. In the back of the church, a small figure stood holding an empty cup, the little girl. But this time he didn't feel fear. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: hope. She began walking toward him, and with each step, the cup in her hands began to fill with a light that spilled over the edges, leaving a trail of luminescence on the floor. Other figures emerged from the shadows: the beggar, the cleaning woman, faces he recognized from the streets he'd walked past daily without really seeing. "Your empire was built on the belief that worth can be measured in dollars," the priest continued. "But true wealth? That's measured in the lives you touch, the hope you inspire, the love you share." The little girl reached Alexander and held out the now glowing cup. Inside, he saw not light but reflections, endless possibilities of what his life could be, what his wealth could do, what his heart could become. His phone buzzed again in his pocket. Probably more news about the mysterious donations. But, for the first time, the thought of losing his money didn't fill him with panic. Something new was taking root in his heart, something that all his wealth had never been able to buy. "What do I do?" he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was asking the priest, the girl, or something larger than either of them. The answer came not in words but in a feeling, a certainty that filled the church like the light from the stained glass windows. His path forward would not be easy. True transformation never is. But for the first time, he understood that the hardest walls to break down were the ones he'd built inside himself. Dawn found Alexander still in the church, watching the first rays of sunlight filter through the stained glass windows. The priest had disappeared sometime during the night, leaving him alone with his thoughts and a profound sense of change. His phone had dozens of missed calls and messages, but one caught his attention: an email from his foundation's accountant detailing where all the mysterious donations had gone. As he read through the list, something remarkable became clear. Each donation had gone to an organization that directly addressed needs he'd encountered, but ignored throughout his life. The largest sum had gone to a children's hospital that had been struggling to stay open, the very kind of facility he'd planned to convert into a luxury medical center. Another significant amount had been directed to a homeless shelter just blocks from his office building, where he'd probably walked past hundreds of people in need without a second glance. Standing up, Alexander felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of his old self was falling away. He walked out of the church into the morning light, seeing his city with new eyes. The streets were coming alive with early morning workers, street vendors setting up their carts, and people hurrying to their destinations. A coffee cart vendor smiled at him, the same man he'd passed countless times without acknowledgement. "The usual, Mr. Sterling?" the vendor asked, surprising him. Had this man known his name all this time? "Yes, please," Alexander replied, realizing he'd never known the vendor's name despite apparently being a regular customer. "I'm Miguel," the vendor said, as if reading his thoughts. "Been serving you coffee for 3 years now." He handed Alexander his coffee with the same bright-eyed look that was becoming eerily familiar. As Alexander reached for his wallet, Miguel waved him off. "It's on the house today. You look like you've had quite a night." The coffee cup felt warm in his hands, and as he looked at it, the logo seemed to shift and change, momentarily forming. The words, "Fill your cup with kindness." His phone buzzed again. Charlotte, his head of legal affairs. This time he answered. "Alex, where have you been? The board is calling another emergency meeting. They're saying the mysterious donations have destabilized the company's financial position. They're voting on your removal this afternoon." Alexander took a sip of his coffee, feeling an unexpected calm. "Tell them I'll be there. And Charlotte, pull up everything we have on our hospital acquisitions. Every document, every email, every projection. Alex, this isn't the time to review old deals. We need to focus on damage control." "No," he said firmly. "It's exactly the time. We're going to make things right." As he walked toward his office building, he noticed small changes everywhere. The security guard's name tag. Had James always worked there? The maintenance woman's kind smile. How had he never noticed Maria's warmth before? The young intern, struggling with a stack of documents. Was that the same person he'd dismissed so callously last week? In his office, the morning light created patterns on his wall, seeming to transform his survival of the fittest motto yet again. This time, it appeared to read, "Survive to lift others." He began pulling up files on his computer, but instead of looking for ways to protect his wealth, he found himself drafting a new plan. The numbers on his screen seemed to rearrange themselves, showing him possibilities he'd never considered, how his resources could be used to help rather than exploit, to heal rather than harm. A soft knock at his door interrupted his work. It was Maria, his executive assistant, looking concerned. "Sir, the board members are gathering early. They're saying you've lost your mind." Alexander smiled, feeling more sane than he had in years. "Maybe I've finally found it, Maria." He looked down at the documents he'd been working on, a complete restructuring plan that would transform his business empire into something entirely different. "Tell them I'll be right there. I have a proposition they won't expect." As Maria turned to leave, he called after her. "And Maria, thank you for everything you've done all these years." The surprise and pleasure on her face made him wonder how many simple thank yous he'd forgotten to say over the years. As he gathered his materials for the board meeting, he caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of his window. The little girl, smiling and nodding encouragingly. This time her appearance didn't frighten him. Instead, it filled him with determination. He had built an empire on the foundation of personal gain. Now he would transform it into something that would truly last, an enterprise built on compassion and service to others. The boardroom awaited, and with it the biggest challenge of his career. But for the first time, Alexander Sterling wasn't fighting to protect his wealth. He was fighting to use it for something greater than himself. The boardroom fell silent as Alexander entered, but it wasn't the usual silence of fear and deference he was accustomed to. This time he could feel the judgment, the concern, the barely concealed hostility. Thomas Bradford, the head of the board, sat at the far end of the table, a stack of documents in front of him. "Alex," Bradford began, his voice carefully neutral, "before we proceed with the vote, would you like to explain the events of the past 24 hours? Alexander walked to the front of the room, aware of every eye following his movement. The morning sun streamed through the windows, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the usually sterile space. As he turned to face the board, he noticed something strange. Each member's reflection in the polished table showed not their current selves, but their younger versions, fresh-faced and full of ideals before the corporate world had hardened them. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," he began, his voice steady, "I'm not here to defend my actions or to maintain my position. I'm here to propose a complete transformation of Sterling Industries." He pressed a button, and the screen behind him came to life. But instead of the financial charts he'd prepared, it showed images of the people their decisions had affected. Hospital patients, workers, communities. He started to apologize for the technical difficulty, but then he saw the board members' faces. They were transfixed by the images, seeing exactly what he'd intended to show them. For years, we've measured success in profit margins and market share, he continued. We've justified our actions with phrases like business necessity and market demands. But what if we've been measuring the wrong things? As he spoke, the light in the room seemed to shift, creating a gentle glow around each person present. Alexander could see something awakening in their eyes, memories of their own early dreams, perhaps, before money became their only goal. Our hospital acquisition plan. He pulled up the documents. I'm proposing we transform it from a luxury development project into a network of community health centers. The profit margins will be lower, but the impact on lives will be immeasurable. Bradford leaned forward, his expression skeptical but curious. And the shareholders, how do you propose to explain this to them? As if in answer, the screen behind Alexander changed again, showing projections he hadn't prepared, long-term analyses demonstrating how ethical business practices and community investment could create sustainable growth and stability. The world is changing, Alexander said, his voice growing stronger. People want companies that do more than just make money. They want businesses that make a difference. He outlined his vision, a complete restructuring of Sterling Industries into a corporation that prioritized social impact alongside financial success. With each point he made, the room seemed to grow brighter, as if the very air was responding to his words. One of the board members, Janet Chen, who had always been his strongest critic, spoke up. This is completely unprecedented. The risks are nothing compared to the risk of continuing as we are, Alexander interrupted gently. He looked directly at her, and for a moment saw tears in her eyes. She was seeing something in him, or perhaps in herself, that touched a long-buried truth. The presentation continued, but it was unlike any board meeting in Sterling Industries' history. As Alexander spoke, each board member experienced something deeply personal. Memories of their first jobs, reminders of why they'd entered business in the first place, visions of what their work could truly mean. Through the windows, the city skyline seemed to shimmer, the usual grey concrete and glass transformed into a landscape of possibility. The boardroom itself appeared to expand, as if the walls were falling away to reveal a broader vision of what their company could become. Near the end of his presentation, Alexander noticed a small figure standing in the corner. The little girl, her cup now overflowing with light. She nodded encouragingly, and he felt a surge of certainty. This wasn't just about saving his position, or even transforming his company. It was about redeeming the very purpose of business itself. I'm not asking you to take a leap of faith, he concluded, though faith was exactly what had brought him to this moment. I'm asking you to take a leap of vision, to see what our real legacy could be. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different from the one that had greeted his entrance. It was filled with possibility, with awakening, with the first stirrings of change. Bradford stood slowly, his expression unreadable. This is not the meeting we expected to have today, he said carefully. Perhaps that's exactly why we needed to have it. The news of Sterling Industries' radical transformation spread through the financial world like wildfire. CNBC analysts debated the sanity of Alexander's decision, while Wall Street Journal headlines questioned whether this was the end of one of America's most aggressive corporate success stories. But in the streets below the towering skyscrapers, a different story was unfolding. Alexander stood in the lobby of what was supposed to have been his newest luxury medical facility. Instead of marble floors and crystal chandeliers, workers were installing comfortable seating areas and child-friendly play spaces. The hospital staff, who had been preparing for layoffs, now found themselves part of a revolutionary healthcare initiative. Dr. Sarah Chen, the hospital's chief of pediatrics, approached him with tears in her eyes. Mr. Sterling, when we heard about the acquisition, we thought it was over. Now, she gestured to the renovations taking place. You've given hope back to so many families. As she spoke, Alexander noticed something remarkable. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to follow her movements, creating a subtle glow around her. In the reflection of a nearby window, he caught a glimpse of all the lives that would be touched by this one decision. Children receiving care, families finding relief, medical staff fulfilled by their work. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from other business leaders, some congratulatory, others concerned, many curious. The business press was calling it the Sterling Revolution, but Alexander knew it was something much simpler, a return to basic human values in a world that had forgotten them. Walking through the hospital corridors, he found himself drawn to the pediatric ward. There, in a playroom filled with young patients, he saw her again, the little girl who had started it all. She sat among the children, her cup now overflowing, with toys and games she was sharing with the others. When she looked up at him, her smile was knowing. "Mr. Sterling?" A nurse touched his arm gently. "Are you all right?" You were staring at the empty corner. He blinked, and the girl was gone. But the feeling of her presence remained. "I'm fine," he replied. "Better than fine, actually. Tell me, what else does this ward need?" As the nurse began listing equipment and supplies that would help their young patients, Alexander felt something he'd never experienced in his years of corporate acquisitions: genuine joy in the act, of giving. Each item she mentioned transformed in his mind from a cost center to an opportunity for healing. Later that afternoon, he had a meeting with his newly formed community impact team, a department that would have been unthinkable in the old Sterling Industries. The team was presenting proposals for similar transformations across all their holdings. The shopping mall development in Brooklyn. Emily Torres, his new head of community relations, pulled up the plans. "We can maintain the retail space, but add affordable housing above it. And look at these numbers." The financial projections on the screen suddenly shifted, showing not just monetary returns, but something new, a social impact index that quantified the benefits to the community. Alexander hadn't asked for this metric, but somehow it was exactly what he needed to see. "And the tech division?" James Chen, another team member, continued. "Instead of developing luxury apps, we're proposing educational software for underfunded schools. The pilot program could reach..." As James spoke, the lights in the conference room flickered softly, and for a moment Alexander could see the faces of countless students who would benefit from this change. The vision was so clear, so real, that it took his breath away. During a break in the meeting, he stepped out onto his office balcony. The city stretched out before him, but it looked different now. Instead of seeing property values and development opportunities, he saw communities, lives interconnected in a vast web of potential. A gentle breeze carried the sound of children laughing from a playground far below. In the swirling patterns of clouds above the city, he could almost make out words. "Every act of kindness creates ripples beyond measure." His assistant Maria appeared at his side with a stack of papers. "The press is requesting interviews about the company's transformation, and there's something else." She handed him a letter that had been delivered by hand. The envelope was worn, the paper cheap, but something about it commanded his attention. Opening it, he found a child's drawing, a simple sketch of a cup overflowing with hearts and stars. At the bottom, in crayon, were the words, "Thank you for filling your cup with love." Alexander felt tears forming in his eyes, but he wasn't embarrassed by them anymore. Each one felt like a drop of grace washing away the last remnants of his old self. The man who had once measured everything in dollars and cents now saw a different kind of wealth all around him, one that multiplied when shared. Sunday morning found Alexander in an unfamiliar place, the small church where his transformation had begun. This time he wasn't alone. The pews were filled with families, many of whom he recognized from the hospital and the communities his company was now serving. The elderly priest who had spoken to him on that fateful night was delivering a sermon about faith and transformation. As he spoke, the sunlight through the stained glass windows created ever-changing patterns on the floor, like a kaleidoscope of possibilities. "Faith," the priest was saying, "isn't just about believing in what we can't see. Sometimes it's about finally seeing what's been there all along." Alexander felt the words resonate deep within him. His hand unconsciously moved to his jacket pocket, where he kept the child's drawing of the overflowing cup. In the past week, similar drawings had appeared mysteriously on his desk, each one marking a moment of significant change in his company's transformation. After the service, people gathered in the church courtyard. Alexander watched as children played, elderly couples shared coffee, and strangers became friends. A young mother approached him, pushing a wheelchair with a small boy who wore a hospital gown decorated with superhero stickers. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Tommy here was one of the first children to receive treatment. Under the new hospital program, the doctors say— She paused, overwhelmed. "They say he's going to be fine now." Tommy looked up at Alexander with bright eyes, the same bright eyes he'd seen in so many faces lately. "Mum says you helped make the hospital better," the boy said. "Did an angel tell you to do it?" Alexander knelt down beside the wheelchair. "Something like that," he replied softly, and for a moment he could see the little girl with the cup standing behind Tommy, her smile radiant. The church's bells began to ring, their sound carrying across the city. Each toll seemed to bring with it a memory of the past week. The board members who had initially opposed his plans now becoming passionate advocates for change. The employees whose lives were being transformed along with the company, the communities that were beginning to flourish under Sterling Industries' new direction. One of his financial advisors had warned him that his personal wealth would decrease significantly under the new business model. But as Alexander watched Tommy's mother wipe tears of joy from her eyes, he understood that he had never been richer. The priest approached him, carrying a small worn Bible. "I believe this belongs to you now," he said, holding out the book. "It was your mother's." Alexander took the Bible with trembling hands. Opening it, he found an inscription he'd never seen before. "To my beloved son, may you always remember that true wealth lies in the heart's capacity for love." As he traced his mother's handwriting with his finger, the words seemed to glow softly. Around him, the courtyard had grown quiet, though it was still full of people. Everyone seemed to be watching something in the distance. Following their gaze, Alexander saw a rainbow arcing across the city sky. Impossible given the clear weather, yet undeniably there. Its colors reflected off the windows of Sterling Tower in the distance, making the entire building shimmer with otherworldly light. "Remind you of anything?" the priest asked quietly. Alexander nodded, remembering the mysterious lights that had filled his office during the board meeting, the glowing cup in the little girl's hands, the divine illumination that had started appearing in the most ordinary places. A child's laugh drew his attention back to the courtyard. Tommy was pointing at something near the church door. There, just for a moment, Alexander saw the little girl again. She stood beside a familiar figure, his mother, as she looked in. His earliest memories. They both smiled at him before fading like morning mist in sunlight. "You know," the priest said, "some people spend their whole lives building towers to reach heaven. But sometimes heaven reaches down to us instead." Alexander clutched his mother's Bible to his chest, feeling a perfect peace settle over him. The business empire he had built was changing, becoming something he had never imagined possible. But more importantly, he himself was changing, rediscovering a faith he had forgotten and a purpose he had never known he needed. The autumn wind carried the scent of change through the city streets. 1 month had passed since Alexander's transformation began, and Sterling Industries had become the talk of the business world, but not for the reasons anyone might have expected. In his newly redesigned office, where the survival of the fittest motto had been replaced with "Lifting others we rise," Alexander sat across from Marcus Chen, CEO of one of his biggest corporate rivals. The man who had once been his fiercest competitor now looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "I've got to admit, Sterling," Marcus said, leaning forward, "when I first heard about your company's transformation, I thought you'd lost your mind. But these quarterly results," he gestured to the reports spread between them, "they're extraordinary, not just the numbers but the impact metrics." Alexander smiled, noticing how the morning light seemed to dance around Marcus as he spoke. "It's a different way of measuring success," he replied, "one that considers more than just profit margins." As if to emphasize his point, the digital display behind his desk suddenly shifted to show images from Sterling Industries' recent community initiatives. The hospital ward full of recovering children, the affordable housing complex rising where luxury condos had been planned, the tech education center teaching coding to underprivileged youth. "But how did you know it would work?" Marcus pressed. "The risk you took—" Before Alexander could answer, a soft knock interrupted them. Maria entered with a stack of letters. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but you asked to see these as soon as they arrived." The letters were from families whose lives had been touched by Sterling Industries' new direction. Each one told a story of hope, of lives changed, of communities transformed. As Alexander shared them with Marcus, he noticed his rival's expression changing, softening. "You know," Marcus said quietly, "I started in this business wanting to make a difference. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that." The light in the office seemed to intensify, and for a moment, Alexander saw the little girl with the cup standing. Behind Marcus, her smile encouraging. When Marcus turned to look, she was gone, but something of her presence remained. "It's never too late to remember," Alexander said gently. Later that afternoon, he attended the opening of Sterling Industries' first community center, built in what had once been an abandoned warehouse. The space had been transformed into a vibrant hub of activity, with classrooms, a health clinic, job training facilities, and a daycare center. As he cut the ribbon, Alexander noticed familiar faces in the crowd: the hospital staff from the pediatric ward, families from the church, former competitors who had become allies in his mission for change. But what caught his attention most were the eyes. Everywhere he looked, he saw that same bright, hopeful gleam he'd first noticed in the little girl who had started his journey. A group of children ran past, playing with paper cups they had decorated in the art room. Each cup had been transformed into something beautiful, one covered in stars, another sprouting paper flowers, all of them somehow catching and reflecting the light in extraordinary ways. Emily Torres, now his chief of community impact, approached with an update on their latest initiative. "The other corporations are starting to follow our lead," she reported, her eyes shining with excitement. 3 more companies have announced similar community programs this week alone." As she spoke, Alexander noticed something remarkable. The light that had been following him since his transformation was now appearing around others, a gentle glow around Emily as she described their successes, a shimmer of hope around the families entering the center, a soft radiance surrounding the children at play. "It's spreading, isn't it?" Emily asked, and Alexander realized she wasn't just talking about their business model. The community center's walls were covered in artwork, created by local children. Among them, Alexander spotted a familiar theme: cups overflowing with light, with love, with possibility. Each one seemed to tell a story of transformation, of empty vessels being filled with something precious and infinite. A small boy tugged at Alexander's sleeve, offering him a paper cup he had decorated. "Look, Mr. Sterling, I made it like the girl showed me." "What girl?" Alexander asked softly, though he already knew the answer. "The one with the glowing cup," the boy replied matter-of-factly. "She says we all have cups to fill." Alexander accepted the gift, his heart full. The paper cup was covered in drawings of tiny hands reaching out to help each other, forming an unbroken chain of connection and care. As he held it, the afternoon sunlight caught it just right, making it glow as if filled with liquid gold. In that moment, Alexander understood that his transformation had never been just about him. Like ripples in a pond, it was spreading outward, touching life after life, filling cup after cup with the same divine light that had changed his heart. The evening sun painted the city in shades of gold as Alexander made his way through the streets that had once seemed so ordinary to him. Every corner now held meaning, every passerby a story waiting to be heard. The coffee cart vendor Miguel waved as he passed, and Alexander stopped for his usual cup. "Business is good," Miguel commented, gesturing to the small seating area that Sterling Industries had helped him set up. "But more than that, it's become a place where people connect." Indeed, the simple coffee cart had transformed into a gathering spot where business people and homeless individuals sat together, sharing conversations and coffee, their differences melting away in the warmth of human connection. As Alexander watched, he noticed how the steam from the coffee cups seemed to twist into meaningful shapes: hearts, hands, symbols of hope and unity. A woman in an expensive suit was sharing her muffin with a man in worn clothes, their laughter bridging worlds that had once seemed impossibly far apart. His phone buzzed with a message from Bradford, the board chairman who had once opposed his vision. "You need to see this," the text read, followed by a link to a financial news article. The headline read, "The Sterling Effect, How One Company's Transformation is Reshaping Corporate America." But it wasn't the headline that caught Alexander's attention. It was the photograph accompanying the article. In it, he stood outside the newly renovated hospital, surrounded by staff and patients. And there, in the background, clearly visible, yet somehow overlooked by the photographers and editors, was the little girl with her cup, her presence captured on film for the first time. His hands trembling slightly, Alexander enlarged the image. The cup in her hands seemed to glow even in the photograph, casting a light that touched everyone in the frame. As he stared at it, the image seemed to move, the light spreading beyond the edges of the photograph to touch the world around him. A group of children ran past, playing some kind of game with paper cups. They were from the new community center, their laughter carrying on the evening air. One of them stopped and held out a cup to a businessman hurrying past with his eyes glued to his phone. The man paused, looked down, and something remarkable happened. His face softened, his posture relaxed, and he knelt down to the child's level. Alexander watched as the businessman took the cup, and for a moment he saw the same divine light he'd been witnessing fill the simple paper vessel. The man's eyes took on that now familiar gleam, and he pulled out his phone again, this time to make a call that Alexander somehow knew would change another life for the better. As twilight settled over the city, Alexander made his way to the small church where his journey had begun. The elderly priest was outside, tending to a small garden that had sprouted up overnight where there had only been concrete before. "Remarkable things happen when we make space for grace," the priest said without looking up. The flowers in the garden seemed to glow softly in the fading light, each one a different color, but all somehow containing the same divine radiance. "The little girl," Alexander began, showing the priest the photograph on his phone. "She's real, isn't she? Not just a vision or a symbol?" The priest straightened up, brushing soil from his hands. "What is reality, Alexander? Is it only what we can touch and measure? Or is it something larger, something that includes the mysteries that transform us?" Before Alexander could respond, the sound of singing drifted from inside the church. A choir was practicing, their voices carrying a hymn that seemed to make the very air vibrate with possibility. Among the voices, he heard one that was achingly familiar, his mother's lullaby, woven into the harmony like a thread of gold. The priest touched his arm gently. "Some cups are filled with coffee," he said, nodding toward Miguel's cart in the distance. "Some with kindness, some with hope. But all of them, when offered with love, contain something of the divine." As if, in response to his words, the last rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, turning every window in the city into stained glass, every cup and vessel into a carrier of light. Alexander understood then that the transformation he had experienced was just the beginning, a first drop in a cup that would never stop overflowing. The news spread like wildfire across the global business community. What had started as one company's radical transformation was becoming a movement. Alexander sat in his office, watching a live broadcast of the Global Business Forum, where CEOs from around the world were discussing what the media had dubbed the Sterling model. "It's not just about corporate responsibility anymore," a tech giant CEO was saying. "What Sterling Industries has shown us is that profit and purpose aren't mutually exclusive. They're interconnected in ways we never imagined." As the CEO spoke, Alexander noticed how the studio lights seemed to create a subtle halo around him, the same glow he'd been seeing more and more frequently around people who embraced the new way of thinking. The camera cut to shots of various Sterling Industries initiatives: the hospital where children were healing, the affordable housing complexes that had created communities instead of just buildings, the education centers that were changing lives. His phone lit up with a message from Emily Torres. "You need to see this." Attached was a video from one of their community centers. As he played it, his breath caught in his throat. In the background of a children's art class, the little girl with the cup was clearly visible, moving from child to child, her presence bringing that now familiar light to each young face she approached. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Marcus Chen, the former rival CEO who had visited him weeks ago. "Alexander," he said, his eyes bright with purpose, "it's happening. Not just here, not just in our industry. Something bigger is taking shape." Together, they watched as more news poured in. Companies across the globe were announcing radical shifts in their business models. Investment firms were creating new categories for spiritually aligned businesses. The stock market was responding, not with panic, but with unexpected stability, as if the financial world itself was acknowledging this new paradigm. "But that's not why I'm here," Marcus continued, pulling out a familiar-looking paper cup from his briefcase. "Last night, I had a visitor, a young girl with the brightest eyes I've ever seen. She didn't say much, just handed me this and smiled. The cup was decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as Alexander looked at them. Words appeared and disappeared like ripples on water. Love multiplies. Faith transforms. Every cup can overflow." As they studied, the cup, the sunlight streaming through Alexander's office windows intensified, creating patterns on the walls that mirrored the cup's designs. The entire room seemed to pulse with a gentle, living energy. "She showed me something," Marcus said softly, his voice filled with wonder. "A vision of what business could be. Not just a way to make money, but a way to fill the world with light. I saw every transaction becoming a blessing, every profit margin making room for grace." Alexander nodded, understanding completely. The vision he'd been given weeks ago was spreading, touching others in their own unique ways. The little girl was no longer appearing just to him. She was reaching out to others who were ready to see, ready to change. Outside his window, the city skyline had taken on an almost ethereal quality. The usual glass and steel were suffused with a golden light that seemed to bridge heaven and earth. In the streets below, he could see people stopping, looking up, their faces illuminated with wonder. Maria hurried in with more updates. Companies were reaching out, asking to partner with Sterling Industries not for profit, but for purpose. Their community initiatives were being replicated across continents. The Sterling Foundation was receiving offers of support from unexpected sources. But what caught Alexander's attention wasn't the global impact. It was the way Maria's eyes shone as she shared the news. The same light he'd first seen in the little girl's eyes was now reflecting in his assistant's gaze, in Marcus's expression, in the faces of countless others who were catching the vision. "It's like watching a sunrise," Marcus mused, standing at the window. "You can't stop it once it starts. You can only watch in awe as it transforms everything it touches." As if in response to his words, a rainbow appeared in the cloudless sky, arcing over the city. But this rainbow was unlike any they had ever seen. Its colors seemed to pour down like gentle rain, touching buildings, streets, and people with its divine light. Alexander touched the Bible his mother had left him, which he now kept on his desk. It fell open to a passage that seemed to glow. "Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." The transformation that had begun with one man's encounter with a mysterious child was becoming something far greater than anyone could have imagined, a revolution of the heart that was reshaping not just business, but the very way people saw their place in the world. The Sterling Industries building had become a beacon of hope in the city skyline. Where once it had cast shadows of intimidation, it now seemed to radiate light from within. The lobby, once a cold expanse of marble and steel, had been transformed into a welcoming space where people from all walks of life gathered. Alexander walked through this space each morning, taking time to greet everyone by name. The security, guards, the cleaning staff, the executives, and the visitors. Today he noticed something extraordinary. Each person he greeted seemed to carry a subtle glow, as if the light he'd first seen in the little girl was now residing within them. "Mr. Sterling," called out James, one of the security guards, "you should see this." He pointed to the large screens in the lobby that usually displayed stock prices and company news. The images were shifting on their own, showing scenes from around the world, other companies implementing similar transformations, communities being renewed, lives being changed. But it wasn't just the content that was remarkable. In each scene, observant viewers might notice a small figure in the background, a young girl with an overflowing cup, her presence a quiet testament to the divine nature of what was unfolding. The elevator ride to his office became a moment of reflection. The mirror-polished walls showed not just his reflection, but echoes of all the lives that had been touched by the transformation. He saw the faces of children in the hospital, families in their new homes, students learning in the community centers, each one glowing with that same inner light. In his office, he found an unexpected visitor waiting, Sarah Mitchell, CEO of the largest investment bank in the country. She stood by the window, watching the city below with tears in her eyes. "I saw her last night," Sarah said without turning around. "The girl with the cup. She showed me something that changed everything." Her voice trembled with emotion. "All these years I thought finance was about numbers, but she showed me it's about flow, like water, like light, like love." As Sarah spoke, the graphs and charts on Alexander's office screens began to move in new ways. Instead of just showing profit and loss, they displayed the flow of resources like rivers of light, connecting communities, nurturing growth, creating possibilities. "We're restructuring our entire investment strategy," Sarah continued, finally, turning to face him. Her eyes held that now familiar gleam. "Not just environmental and social governance, something deeper. We're calling it divine commerce." The term sent a ripple through the air, making the light in the office pulse gently. Alexander's mother's Bible, sitting on his desk, fell open to a new passage. "Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down and shaken together and running over." A soft knock at the door announced Maria's arrival. She carried a stack of papers that seemed to shimmer in her hands. "The new reports are in," she said, her face glowing with joy. "The impact metrics are beyond anything we imagined." But these weren't ordinary impact reports. As Alexander and Sarah looked at them, the numbers transformed before their eyes, showing not just quantitative results but qualitative changes. The strengthening of human bonds, the renewal of hope, the restoration of faith. Through the window, they could see other skyscrapers in the financial district beginning to change. The usual harsh glint of glass and steel was softening, taking on a warmer, more human quality. The very architecture of commerce seemed to be responding to this new understanding of business's true purpose. Sarah moved to the window, pressing her hand against the glass. "Look," she whispered. Below, people were gathering in the plaza, forming circles of connection. From above, the patterns they created looked like ripples spreading from countless drops of divine grace. "It's not just about filling cups anymore," Alexander realized aloud. "It's about becoming vessels ourselves, channels for something greater than profit or power." As if in confirmation, a gentle breeze swept through the office, though the EITI windows were closed. It carried the scent of hope and the sound of distant laughter, children playing in the community centers, families gathering in renewed neighborhoods, communities coming together in ways that transcended economic status. The little girl appeared briefly in the reflection of the window, standing between Alexander and Sarah. Her cup now seemed to contain not just light, but the very essence of what business could be, a force for divine good in the world. As she faded from view, her smile remained, imprinted on their hearts like a promise of things to come. Sarah turned to Alexander, her expression transformed by understanding. "We're not just changing business," she said softly. "We're remembering its sacred purpose." 3 months had passed since Alexander's first encounter with the mysterious girl, and the world had changed in ways that defied conventional explanation. The Sterling Industries headquarters had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, drawing visitors from around the globe who sensed something extraordinary was happening. On this particular morning, Alexander stood in the building's rooftop garden, a space that had once been reserved for executive functions but was now open to all. The garden had transformed itself in ways that seemed miraculous. Flowers bloomed, out of season, their petals catching and reflecting light in impossible ways. Emily Torres joined him, carrying a tablet that displayed the latest data from their global initiatives. "It's extraordinary," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Every community we touch seems to experience the same phenomenon. People report seeing a little girl with a glowing cup, and then—" She gestured to the screen, where images showed communities around the world experiencing remarkable transformations. As they watched, the tablet's display began to shift, showing not just statistics and charts, but the actual flow of positive change, visible as streams of light connecting different parts of the world. What had started in New York had spread to London, Tokyo, Mumbai, Lagos, Rio de Janeiro, and beyond. "The United Nations called this morning," Emily continued. "They want to study what they're calling the Sterling phenomenon. But I don't think they'll find the answers in their usual metrics." Alexander smiled, watching as a group of schoolchildren toured the garden below. Each child carried a paper cup they had decorated in art class, and each cup seemed to catch and hold the morning light in a unique way. Among them, barely visible but undeniably present, moved the little girl who had started it all, her cup now overflowing with a light that touched each child she passed. "Mr. Sterling," called one of the children, waving up at him. "Look what happens when we share." The children gathered in a circle, holding their cups together. As they did, the light within each cup seemed to grow stronger, creating a beautiful pattern that rose into the air like a fountain of pure radiance. The sight drew gasps from a group of international business leaders who were touring the facility. Among them was Chen Wei, CEO of China's largest technology company, who had flown in specifically to understand the transformation he'd been hearing about. "In our culture," Chen Wei said, approaching Alexander, "we speak of qi, the flow of energy that connects all things. What I see here, it's like qi made visible." His eyes held that familiar gleam as he spoke, and Alexander noticed a subtle glow beginning to emanate from him. Throughout the day, more visitors arrived. Corporate leaders, community organizers, spiritual teachers, and ordinary people, drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. Each person who entered the building seemed to leave with that same inner light, as if something profound had been awakened within them. In the afternoon, Alexander received a call from the elderly priest. "It's time," he said simply. "The garden is ready." Alexander knew immediately what he meant. The small church garden where his transformation had begun had grown into something extraordinary, a space where flowers bloomed with divine light, where visitors reported experiencing profound spiritual awakenings. Making his way to the church, Alexander found the usually quiet street filled with people. They stood in reverent silence, watching as light seemed to pour from the garden's flowers and plants, creating patterns in the air that looked like flowing scripture. The priest stood in the middle of it all, his simple black clothes somehow containing and reflecting the divine light. "You see," he said as Alexander approached, "when one cup overflows with grace, it fills another and another. The flow cannot be contained by any human structure." As if to demonstrate his words, the light from the garden began to rise, forming a column that reached toward the sky. Similar columns of light could be seen rising from other parts of the city, from the hospital, the community centers, the schools, and every place where the transformation had taken root. The little girl appeared beside them, her cup now seeming to contain not just light, but the essence of divine love itself. She smiled at Alexander, and for the first time she spoke directly to him. "This is just the beginning." The words echoed with profound meaning, carrying with them a vision of what was yet to come. Alexander saw businesses transformed into channels of blessing, economies reshaped by divine principles, communities renewed by the flow of grace. As the sun began to set, the city itself seemed to pulse with a new kind of energy. The harsh lines of urban architecture had softened, the usual noise of traffic had mellowed into something like music, and everywhere people walked with that inner light shining from their eyes. "Remember," the priest said softly, "every cup that overflows becomes a source for others. Every heart that opens becomes a channel for grace. Every business that transforms becomes a beacon of hope." The World Economic Forum in Davos had never seen anything quite like it. As Alexander took the stage to deliver his keynote address, The usual backdrop of economic charts and corporate logos had been replaced by something extraordinary, a living display of light that seemed to respond to the energy in the room. The audience was filled with the world's most powerful business leaders, politicians, and thought leaders, but something was different about them today. Many already carried that distinctive gleam in their eyes, and others seemed on the verge of their own awakening. "We've been measuring the wrong things," Alexander began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "We thought wealth was about accumulation, but it's really about flow. We thought power came from control, but it actually comes from letting go." As he spoke, the light display behind him began to show what he was describing, the flow of resources, like rivers of divine energy, connecting communities, nurturing growth, creating possibilities. The audience watched in amazement as their own companies appeared in the display, shown not as organizational charts, but as living networks of light and possibility. Sarah Mitchell, the investment banker who had embraced the concept of divine commerce, stood up to share her experience. "Our traditional economic models couldn't explain what was happening," she said. "Companies that adopted these principles weren't just succeeding, they were transforming entire communities. The data they presented defied conventional analysis. Companies that had embraced the new paradigm were showing remarkable results, but not just in financial terms. They were generating what Sarah called grace dividends, measurable positive impacts that rippled out far beyond their immediate operations." During the presentation, attendees began to notice something remarkable. The usual tension and competition that marked such gatherings had been replaced by a spirit of cooperation and shared purpose. People who had been rivals for decades found themselves sharing visions of collaboration. A Saudi oil executive stood to share his experience. "We thought our wealth came from what we pulled from the earth. Now we see it comes from what we can give back." As he spoke, the lights in the hall seemed to pulse with approval. The little girl appeared briefly at the edge of the stage, her cup overflowing with light that seemed to touch each person in the audience. Though not everyone could see her directly, everyone felt her presence, a tangible sense of divine purpose that filled the room. Alexander continued, sharing the story of his own transformation and the principles that had emerged. "Business is not just a mechanism for profit, it's a channel for divine blessing. Wealth is not meant to be hoarded, it's meant to flow like living water. Competition gives way to cooperation when we align with higher purpose. Every transaction can be an act of grace. Success is measured not in dollars, but in lives transformed." As he spoke these principles, they appeared in the air above him in letters of light, each word seeming to carry its own divine energy. The audience watched in wonder as their phones and tablets began displaying impossible data. Metrics that measured the flow of blessing, indicators of spiritual impact, graphs that showed the growth of hope and faith in communities. A Chinese tech entrepreneur rose to speak, her face glowing with inner light. "In our pursuit of artificial intelligence, we forgot about divine intelligence. Now we see that true innovation comes from aligning with sacred principles." The revolution that had started with one man's encounter with a mysterious child had grown into something that was reshaping the very foundations of global commerce. The World Economic Forum, once a symbol of material power, had become a gathering of light-bearers, each one awakening to a higher purpose for business. As the session concluded, the hall was filled with a gentle light that seemed to connect everyone present. Competitors became collaborators, cynics became believers, and the very notion of economics was being redefined before their eyes. The little girl appeared one final time, standing in the center of the stage. Her cup now seemed to contain not just light, but the very essence of divine economics, a new way of understanding wealth, value, and purpose that would transform the world. "Remember," her voice echoed in their hearts, "every business can be a blessing. Every transaction a transfer of grace, every market a manifestation of divine love." The light from her cup rose up, forming a dome over the gathering that reflected in countless eyes now bright with understanding and purpose. The transformation was no longer just a corporate phenomenon. It was becoming a global awakening to the sacred purpose of commerce itself. 6 months had passed since the Davos conference, and the transformation that had begun with one man's encounter with a mysterious child had become a global phenomenon. Alexander stood at his office window, watching as the sun rose over a city that seemed to glow from within. The streets below were filled with a new kind of energy. People walked with purpose, their eyes bright with that now familiar inner light. Street vendors shared their wares with generous hearts, business people stopped to help strangers, and everywhere small acts of kindness created ripples of divine grace. Maria entered the office carrying not just the usual morning reports, but something more extraordinary, a collection of letters and photographs from around the world. Each one told a story of transformation, accompanied by images that somehow captured the divine light that was spreading. "Look at this," she said, laying out the photographs. They showed scenes from different continents, an African marketplace where traders had established a new economic system based on blessing and abundance, an Asian tech hub where companies competed to create the most positive social impact, a South American community where business leaders had transformed abandoned factories into centers of hope and healing. In each photograph, observant viewers could spot a small figure with a glowing cup, her presence a quiet testimony to the divine nature of what was unfolding. But what was more remarkable was how many other cups now glowed with similar light, carried by children and adults alike, each one becoming a vessel for grace. The intercom buzzed, Emily Torres with an urgent update. "Alexander, you need to see this." The wall screen came to life, showing news feeds from around the world. The traditional stock tickers and market reports had been replaced by something new, indicators of social harmony, measurements of community well-being, and what were being called blessing indices. But it wasn't just the metrics that had changed. The very language of business had transformed. Words like profit and competition had given way to abundance and cooperation. Corporate missions were now expressed in terms of divine purpose rather than market dominance. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Thomas Bradford, the former board chairman who had once opposed Alexander's vision. "The universities are calling," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "They want to establish new programs in divine economics. They're saying we need to completely reimagine how we teach business." As they discussed this development, the light in the office seemed to intensify. The little girl appeared, sitting quietly in a corner, her cup overflowing with a radiance that filled the room. This time she wasn't alone. Other figures of light gathered around her, each one representing a different aspect of the transformation taking place. "You see," she said, her voice carrying that mixture of childlike simplicity and divine wisdom, "when business remembers its true purpose, everything changes. Every transaction becomes a blessing, every exchange an act of love." The walls of the office seemed to dissolve, giving them a vision of the transformation spreading across the globe. They saw corporate towers softening into beacons of light, factory smoke transforming into rainbow-hued blessing, and money itself becoming visible as streams of divine energy flowing where it was most needed. Alexander watched as his own company's light connected with others, forming a network of grace that spanned continents. The Sterling model had evolved into something far beyond corporate transformation. It had become a channel for divine purpose to flow into every aspect of human commerce. A group of international business students toured the building below, each carrying a copy of the new textbook, Divine Commerce, Business as a Channel of Grace. As they walked, their passionate discussions about purpose-driven economics rose, up like music, harmonizing with the greater symphony of transformation taking place. The elderly priest appeared in the doorway, his simple presence carrying that familiar sense of divine purpose. "Remember," he said softly, "this was never about changing business alone. It was about remembering the sacred in the everyday, about seeing divine purpose in every exchange." As he spoke, the light from the little girl's cup seemed to pour out, in endless abundance, touching each person present with a renewed sense of purpose. The transformation that had begun with one man's awakening had become a global renaissance of sacred commerce, where every business transaction carried the potential for divine blessing. Thomas Bradford, who had once been the voice of traditional corporate thinking, stood at the window with tears in his eyes. "I never imagined," he whispered, "that business could be this beautiful." The annual Sterling Industries stakeholder meeting looked nothing like the corporate gatherings of the past. Instead of a sterile conference center, it was held in the transformed garden that had once been the company's private executive retreat. The space had become a living testament to the new way of doing business, where flowers bloomed with divine light and the very air seemed to pulse with possibility. Shareholders sat alongside community members, corporate executives next to social workers, and financial analysts beside spiritual leaders. The traditional separation between business and society had dissolved, replaced by a recognition that all were part of the same divine flow. Alexander stood to address the gathering, but before he could speak, something remarkable happened. The little girl appeared in the center of the garden, her cup glowing brighter than ever before. As everyone watched in wonder, she began to walk through the crowd, touching each person's own cup, paper cups, coffee cups, water glasses, whatever they held, with her light. One by one, the vessels began to glow, creating a garden of living light. Even those who couldn't see the girl directly felt her presence, experienced the transformation she brought. The light spread from person to person, cup to cup, heart to heart. "This," Alexander began, his voice filled with quiet joy, "is what business was always meant to be. Not a tool for accumulation, but a channel for blessing. Not a means of division, but a path to unity." As he spoke, images appeared in the air above the garden, not projected by any earthly device, but manifesting from the light itself. They showed the impact of the past year's transformation. Hospitals filled with healing light, schools where children learn not just facts, but divine wisdom, businesses that had become fountains of blessing for their communities. Sarah Mitchell, now the world's leading expert in divine economics, stood to share the latest findings. "The numbers tell an extraordinary story," she said, "but the real metrics are written in transformed lives and renewed hearts." The data she presented seemed to come alive, floating in the air as streams of light that showed the flow of blessing throughout the global economy. Traditional economic indicators had been replaced by measurements of joy, indexes of compassion, and what she called grace multiplication factors. A young entrepreneur from Kenya rose to speak, her face glowing with inner light. "In my village," she said, "we used to measure wealth in cattle and coins. Now we measure it in overflowing cups and transformed lives." As she spoke, an image appeared of her community, where a small business cooperative had become a beacon of hope for the entire region. The little girl moved to the center of the garden again, and this time she began to sing. The melody was simple, but carried echoes of every sacred song ever sung. As she sang, others joined in, first the children present, then adults, until the garden was filled with a harmony that seemed to bridge heaven and earth. The cups in everyone's hands began to overflow, but not with water or wine. They overflowed with pure light, with divine love, with the essence of blessing itself. The light flowed from cup to cup, person to person, creating patterns of connection that revealed the true nature of sacred commerce. Alexander watched as business leaders who had once been fierce competitors now shared their cups with each other, the light between them growing stronger with each exchange. He saw investors discovering that true returns couldn't be measured in dollars, and economists realizing that the most important transactions were those that multiplied joy. The elderly priest stood quietly at the edge of the garden, his eyes twinkling with divine wisdom. "You see," he said to those nearby, "when we remember that every cup can be a chalice, every transaction a communion, every business a blessing, that's when the real transformation begins." As the sun began to set, the garden glowed with its own light, thousands of illuminated cups held by people whose hearts had been transformed. The little girl moved among them one last time, her own cup now seeming to contain not just light, but the very essence of divine purpose. "Remember," she said, her voice carrying to every heart present, "the cup is not meant to hold but to share. The blessing is not meant to keep, but to give. The light is not meant to contain, but to spread." And spread it did, flowing out from the garden into the city beyond, touching life after life with its transforming power. What had begun as one man's encounter with divine grace had become a movement that was reshaping the very foundations of human commerce and connection. 1 year had passed since Alexander's first encounter with the mysterious girl on that fateful evening. The transformation that had begun with one man's awakening had reshaped the world in ways that defied explanation. On this particular morning, he stood in the small church where his journey of faith had begun, watching as people from all walks of life filled the pews. The church had become a symbol of the new way of living and doing business. Its walls seemed to pulse with divine light, and the stained glass windows told not just biblical stories, but the story of how love and grace had transformed the modern world of commerce. The elderly priest stood at the altar, his simple presence radiating that familiar sense of divine purpose. "Today," he announced, "we celebrate not just a transformation of business, but a transformation of hearts." As he spoke, the little girl appeared walking down the center aisle. Her cup, now seemingly made of pure light, overflowed with a radiance that touched everyone present. Behind her came a procession of people carrying their own glowing vessels, cups, bowls, vessels of every kind, each one shining with divine purpose. Emily Torres, who had witnessed the transformation from the beginning, stood to share her observations. "What we're seeing isn't just a new economic model," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's a remembering of what business was always meant to be, a channel for divine blessing." The walls of the church seemed to become transparent, revealing the city beyond. But it was no longer just a city of concrete and steel. Every building, every street, every transaction had become visible as flows of light and blessing. Business deals appeared as exchanges of divine energy, markets pulsed with sacred purpose, and every workplace glowed with spiritual significance. Marcus Chen, the former rival CEO who had become a close ally, shared his perspective. In ancient China, they spoke of the Tao, the way all things should flow. We're seeing that principle restored to the world of business, where every exchange becomes part of a divine symphony. As if in response to his words, music began to fill the church, not from the organ or choir, but from the very air itself. It was the sound of sacred commerce, the harmony of hearts aligned with divine purpose. Each business transaction added its note to the symphony, creating a melody that bridged heaven and earth. The little girl moved through the congregation, touching each person's vessel with her light. As she did, their own divine purposes became visible, glowing symbols and patterns that showed how each one was meant to contribute to the greater harmony. Sarah Mitchell, who had pioneered the field of divine economics, rose to speak. "The markets have become mirrors of grace," she said, as graphs and charts made of light appeared in the air around her. "We're measuring things we once thought immeasurable. The multiplication of joy, the compound interest of kindness, the dividends of divine love." Through the church's windows, they could see the transformation continuing to spread. Office buildings had become lighthouses of purpose, factories had transformed into fountains of blessing, and even the stock exchange had become a temple of sacred exchange. Alexander watched as business leaders who had once been consumed by profit now walked with the light of divine purpose in their eyes. Former competitors shared their resources with joy, entrepreneurs sought ways to multiply blessings rather than margins, and every transaction carried the potential for spiritual transformation. The elderly priest moved among the congregation, his presence awakening deeper understanding in each person he passed. "You see," he said quietly, "when business remembers its sacred origin, everything becomes an opportunity for grace. Every exchange becomes a chance to share divine love." As the sun reached its zenith, its light joined with the radiance flowing from hundreds of glowing vessels. The little girl stood at the altar, her cup raised high, and for a moment everyone present could see what she had seen all along. A world where business and spirituality were not separate, where every transaction could be a testament to divine love. "The transformation is not complete," she said, her voice carrying divine wisdom, "until every heart becomes a vessel for grace, until every business becomes a channel for blessing, until every exchange becomes an expression of love." The symphony of sacred commerce reached a crescendo, lifting every heart present into a new understanding of what was possible when business aligned with divine purpose. The transformation that had begun with one man's awakening had become a global awakening to the sacred nature of all human exchange. The transformation had reached every corner of the globe, but its heart remained in the small church garden where Alexander now stood with the elderly priest. The flowers bloomed with divine light, each petal a testament to the miraculous changes that had swept through the world of business and beyond. "Did you ever imagine," the priest asked gently, "that one encounter with divine grace could change so much?" Before Alexander could answer, the garden began to fill with visitors, people whose lives had been touched by the transformation. They came carrying vessels of every kind, each one glowing with its own inner light. Children with paper cups decorated in Sunday school, business leaders with crystal glasses, workers with simple mugs, all now understood as chalices of divine purpose. The little girl appeared among the flowers, her presence bringing that familiar sense of sacred possibility. Her cup, which had once seemed empty, now overflowed with a light that contained the essence of everything they had learned. Every business can be a blessing. Every transaction can carry grace. Every exchange can multiply joy. Every workplace can become sacred space. As she moved through the garden, touching each person's vessel with her own, the air filled with soft music, the harmony of hearts aligned with divine purpose. The garden itself seemed to expand, its boundaries dissolving to reveal the transformed city beyond. Emily Torres arrived with a group of international students who had been studying the new principles of divine economics. "The most remarkable thing," she said, her eyes bright with understanding, "is how natural it all feels now. As if we're remembering something we always knew but had forgotten." The students shared stories from their own countries, tales of businesses transformed into channels of blessing, of markets that measured success in joy rather than profits, of competitions that had become collaborations in spreading divine grace. Sarah Mitchell joined them, carrying what looked like traditional financial reports, but were actually filled with measurements of blessing, indexes of spiritual impact, and maps of grace flowing through the global economy. "We've discovered," she said, "that true wealth multiplies when shared, that divine purpose creates abundance beyond measure." The garden continued to fill with people whose lives had been touched by the transformation. Miguel, the coffee cart vendor, served drinks that seemed to glow within a light. The hospital staff shared stories of healing that went beyond the physical. Business leaders who had once been rivals now worked together to spread blessing through their enterprises. As the sun began to set, its light merged with the divine radiance that filled the garden. The little girl stood in the center, her cup raised high, and everyone present felt their own vessels responding, lifting up in a gesture of shared purpose. "Remember," she said, her voice carrying divine wisdom, "the cup is not the blessing. It is the vessel. You are not meant to contain the light, but to share it. Every business, every transaction, every moment carries the potential for divine grace." Alexander looked around at the gathered crowd, at faces illuminated with inner light, at vessels glowing with divine purpose, at the transformation that had begun with his own awakening and spread throughout the world. He understood now that this was more than a change in how business was conducted. It was a remembering of humanity's sacred purpose. The elderly priest stepped forward, his presence bringing a deeper silence to the garden. "The question was never whether business could be sacred," he said softly. "The question was whether we could remember its divine origin and purpose." As night fell, the garden glowed with its own light, thousands of illuminated vessels held by people whose hearts had been transformed. The little girl moved among them one last time, her cup now seeming to contain not just light, but the very essence of divine love. "The transformation continues," she said, her voice reaching every heart present. "Each of you is now a vessel of grace, each business a channel of blessing, each transaction an opportunity for divine love to flow into the world." The garden filled with a gentle music that seemed to come from the stars themselves, a harmony of heaven and earth, of commerce and compassion, of divine purpose expressed through human exchange. What had begun with one man's encounter with grace had become a symphony of sacred commerce playing throughout the world. On a crisp autumn evening, Exactly 1 year after his first encounter with the mysterious girl, Alexander found himself walking the same street where it had all begun. The city had transformed beyond recognition, yet somehow remained more truly itself than ever before. Every building glowed with inner light, and the faces of passers-by shone with divine purpose. He stopped at the exact spot where he had first met the little girl. The concrete sidewalk now bore an intricate pattern that seemed to have grown from within, swirling designs that looked like flowing cups and streams of light. As he stood there, memories washing over him, a small voice called out, "Would you like to make a difference today?" Alexander turned to find a young boy sitting where the little girl had once sat. He held a paper cup decorated with stars and hearts, glowing with that now familiar divine light. Behind him stood the little girl herself, smiling that knowing smile. "You see," she said, her voice carrying that mixture of childlike simplicity and divine wisdom, "the cycle continues. Each person who awakens becomes a channel for others to awaken too." The boy held up his cup, and Alexander watched in wonder as the light within it began to flow outward, touching others passing by. Each person it reached paused, their own daily vessels, coffee cups, water bottles, whatever they carried, beginning to glow with the same divine light. Emily Torres appeared carrying a tablet that showed the latest global impact measurements, but instead of numbers and charts, the screen displayed flowing streams of light that represented the movement of blessing throughout the world. "It's extraordinary," she said, her eyes bright with wonder. "Every time someone remembers the sacred purpose of business, it creates a new fountain of blessing. The transformation keeps multiplying, growing deeper and reaching further." As they watched, the sidewalk beneath their feet became transparent, revealing the flows of divine energy that now powered the city's commerce. Every transaction glowed with sacred purpose. Every business deal created ripples of blessing that spread far beyond their original point of contact. The elderly priest emerged from the evening shadows, his presence bringing that familiar sense of divine purpose. "Do you remember," he asked Alexander, "when you thought wealth was something to be hoarded? Now look at how it flows, like living water, bringing life wherever it touches." Above them, the Sterling Industries building glowed like a lighthouse, its light joining with similar beacons of transformed business across the city skyline. But Alexander's attention was drawn to something simpler, the way people stopped to help each other, the spontaneous acts of kindness, the joy that flowed through every interaction. Sarah Mitchell joined them, her economist's mind now attuned to different kinds of metrics. "We're seeing something unprecedented," she said. "The more blessing is shared, the more it multiplies. The old laws of scarcity have been replaced by divine abundance." The little girl moved through the gathering crowd, touching each person's vessel with her own cup of light. As she did, their eyes opened to see what she had always seen, the divine potential in every exchange, the sacred purpose in every transaction. "Remember," she said, her voice reaching every heart, "the transformation begins anew each time someone chooses to see business as a channel for blessing, each time someone remembers that true wealth flows from divine love." The boy with the paper cup stood up, his vessel now overflowing with light. One by one, others in the crowd raised their own cups, creating a constellation of divine purpose that lit up the evening sky. The transformation that had begun with one man's awakening had become a continuous flow of grace, passing from person to person, business to business, heart to heart. Alexander knelt beside the boy, seeing in his bright eyes the same light that had changed his own life a year ago. "What would you like to be when you grow up?" he asked softly. The boy's answer came with a wisdom beyond his years. "I want to be a cup that overflows, so others can remember how to shine." The final gathering took place in a space that existed somewhere between heaven and earth, the transformed garden of the small church where Alexander had first understood the true meaning of grace. But now the garden seemed infinite, its boundaries extending to embrace all who came to celebrate the endless flow of divine blessing. People came from every corner of the world, each carrying their own glowing vessels. Business leaders who had once measured success in profits now carried cups overflowing with divine purpose. Workers whose jobs had been transformed into sacred callings brought vessels that shone with the light of fulfilled purpose. Children whose future would be shaped by this new understanding of commerce carried simple paper cups that glowed with infinite potential. The elderly priest stood in the center of the garden, beside a fountain that flowed with pure light. "We gather," he said, his voice carrying to every heart, "not to mark an ending, but to celebrate an eternal beginning." For every time someone remembers the sacred purpose of business, the transformation begins anew. The little girl appeared beside the fountain, her cup now seeming to contain the very essence of divine love. As she moved through the crowd, each person's vessel began to glow brighter, creating a symphony of light that rose into the evening sky. Alexander watched as the transformation he had experienced spread before his eyes once again. Competitors becoming collaborators, transactions becoming blessings, markets becoming channels of grace. But now he understood that this was not a one-time change. It was an eternal flow, constantly renewing itself through each person who chose to see business as a sacred trust. Emily Torres shared the final measurements from the Global Blessing Index, but the numbers had transformed into pure light, showing how divine purpose flowed through the world's commerce. Sarah Mitchell's economic models had evolved into living mandalas of light, revealing the infinite patterns of sacred exchange. The garden filled with music, not from any earthly instrument, but from the harmony of hearts aligned with divine purpose. Each business transaction added its note to the symphony, creating a melody that bridged heaven and earth. The little girl began to sing, her voice carrying the wisdom of ages. In every exchange, remember love in every transaction, share grace in every business, channel blessing in every moment, shine with divine purpose. As she sang, the garden seemed to expand, revealing the transformed world beyond. Cities glowed with sacred commerce, markets pulsed with divine energy, and every workplace had become a temple of purpose. The transformation that had begun with one man's awakening had become an eternal dance of giving and receiving, of blessing and being blessed. The elderly priest stepped forward one last time, his presence bringing a deeper silence to the garden. "The cup," he said softly, "is not just a vessel for divine light. It is a reminder of our true purpose, to let love flow through every aspect of life, including our business dealings." The little girl raised her cup, and everyone present felt their own vessels respond, lifting up in a gesture of shared purpose. The light that flowed between them formed patterns of connection that revealed the true nature of sacred commerce. An endless circle of giving and receiving, each transaction a chance to multiply divine love. "Remember," she said, her voice reaching across time and space, "you are not meant to contain the light, but to share it. Every business can be a fountain of blessing, every transaction a moment of grace, every exchange an opportunity for divine love to flow into the world." As the stars appeared above the garden, they seemed to mirror the constellation of lights below. Thousands of glowing vessels held by people whose hearts had been transformed. The symphony of sacred commerce reached a crescendo, lifting every heart present into a new understanding of eternal possibility. Alexander stood in the garden, where his journey had begun, understanding now that it had no end. The transformation would continue, flowing like living water through the world of business, touching life after life with divine purpose. The little girl appeared one final time, her cup overflowing with infinite light. "The story never ends," she said, smiling that knowing smile. "It lives in every heart that chooses to see business as a channel for blessing, in every transaction that multiplies joy, in every moment that divine love flows through human exchange." And so the transformation continued, an eternal dance of divine purpose expressed through the sacred art of business, flowing like living water through the hearts of all who chose to become vessels of grace.